We are about to embark upon a series of strange and exciting, dangerous adventures. Adventures that will lead us to all parts of the world.
Hello and welcome to another Bad Comic Review. This time we are looking at Detective Comics number 58. This is the 2023 Facsimile edition of the December 1941 book that introduces the Penguin. Covers by Fred Ray and Jerry Robinson, and of course features multiple stories. The first one is an untitled story about the Penguin, written by Bill Finger, pencils by Bob Kane, inks by Jerry Robinson and George Roussos. And in this we're introduced to the Penguin, who's been robbing people, and he eventually takes over a gang using his umbrellas. And of course the trick umbrellas are introduced right away, mostly for guns, but they also do shoot gas. Now this of course puts him at odds with the Batman immediately, and Batman gets framed for some crimes that the Penguin did. Now in this issue the Penguin is using a different name, and it's probably a fake name, and that is the name of Mr. Boniface. Now besides Batman and Robin doing little quips throughout the story, we also have, like I said, Penguin's trick umbrellas, but Penguin also does escape in this issue, so it's not just the usual fake death scenario. The bad guy actually just gets away. And of course there is a fair amount of action to the story, which has kind of become the standard. It's mostly a lot of fighting, and that works pretty well for the story, but the quips got a bit tiresome. The next story is Spy by Ed Moore, and this finds Bart Regan going undercover as a potential revolutionary and meeting up with some other guys that want to finance a revolution and sell munitions. It's a very compact story with some fairly rigid art that really cuts to the chase and finds Bart dealing with the scenario a little bit ludicrously. There is a laughs section too, which are just little one-panel gags, and that's written by Henry Boltinoff. Then we've got Larry Steele, and this is The Case of the Frightened Sister. This one was done by Cliff Young, and we find this strong independent woman for the 1940s dealing with a couple of rogues that are trying to manhandle her into a vehicle. Now her name is Claudia, but then when Cliff tries to intervene, she wants none of his nonsense either, and she takes off in a cab. But he thinks he sees her again, but this time she's going by the name Lorna, and he gets very confused by what's going on. And Lorna's trying to get a job as a singer, but when she does, things go kind of screwy, and Larry's left to do some dirty work to try and sort things out when it appears that Lorna gets kidnapped. Well, we learn the secret between the two women, and there's a pretty silly wrap up that really just doesn't work out real well. It's not a very great story. Some of the art's pretty solid, but the artist's attempt to draw faces is often very, very haunting and uncanny valley. But the backgrounds look really good, and overall the art is better than the story. Then we've got Cliff Crosby, which was written and drawn by Chad Grothkopf, and this time Cliff is mistaken for somebody else by this crazy guy who shoots at him while he's out skiing, and it turns out there's this other fellow that is dressed like him and kind of looks like him. So Cliff has been mistaken for Kenneth Cravath, but unfortunately the gentleman who's really angry at him is a guy named Big Bull, and Kenneth is dating Big Bull's daughter and thinks that he got cheated out of a silver mine deal, which from the description it gives in the book, the guy's just was hard up for money before the silver was found in the mine. But there was some confusion because Kenneth was going to cut him in on the profits, but the guy wouldn't listen to reason. So Cliff has to sort things out and does so in a slightly cunning way by challenging him to a ski race. It's an okay little story, doesn't have to do with anything, and it's kind of a throwaway backup, but as far as some of the other stories go, it's much better than the Larry Steele one. Then we've got Speed Saunders, Ace Investigator, and The Cigarette Murder. This was done by Ed Winarski. Now the art in this story is really good, but this is one of those whodunits, and it's a little bit trite, and unfortunately due to the art being really, really old, it's kind of hard to see one of the clues that's hinted at, which would help the reader see what Speed Saunders sees. It's pretty straightforward though, you can figure out the clues really easily, and it is kind of a dialogue dump because they do have to wrap this up really fast. It's a really condensed story, so there's a lot of talking, and the talking very much feels like a 40s movie, but it's an okay little story. It's just aimed at younger audiences. There is a prose story called Hill Hates by Edward Miles. I don't care about those because this is a comic book, not a novella. Then we get to The Crimson Avenger by Jack Leedy, and Lee Travis gets kidnapped by some fake actors, and he is held for ransom for a couple days. Once the ransom is paid, he is released, and then the Crimson Avenger goes to work tracking down the people that did it. And the way he tracks them down is probably the most logical deduction scenario in the history of comic books, because it's the simplest. But we do see the Crimson Avenger has on his more standard superhero fair outfit in this one, and it's very generic costume. Unfortunately, I don't think it works. I think the cloak and hat worked better for the Crimson Avenger, but the superhero craze was really sweeping comics at this time, so they wanted him in costume, and it just doesn't work for the character. He's a much better, more interesting character wearing the cloak and the hat than he is wearing the very, very generic superhero costume. Then we've got Steve Malone, District Attorney, which is by Don Lynch. And in that one, we've got what appears to be a double murder, and a woman is seen fleeing from the general area of the hotel, but Steve Malone is not about to be led astray by a woman who may or may not have done it. Now, it looks like somebody may have staged the scene, but thankfully Steve is there to deduce who did it and how. And it's actually a pretty good deduction. Why the person did it is really wrapped up in the last two panels with this massive dialogue dump, but it was a pretty interesting story at least, and the art's not too bad. Like the Crimson Avenger story, it had decent art, and it does help kind of move things along to have good art, but it is again aimed at a much younger audience. We've got some more jokes with a little section called gags, but that's not attributed to any specific person. And then there is finally a Slam Bradley story. And this one finds Slam getting slapped across the face right out of the gate, and Shorty of course has to just state the obvious. And it turns out this lady slapped Slam specifically so she could get a job to prove she could handle this spoiled little kid. So she gets the job as a nanny, and this kid looks like he's about a 45-year-old James Cagney. So Slam is just constantly on the losing side for the majority of the story. He gets slapped by at least two women, and he gets a clock thrown at him, and some bad guys kind of rough him up. Shorty gets hit with a book too, so yeah, it's kind of on him. But when the little kid that was supposed to be getting babysat gets kidnapped, because that's what his dad was worried about, Slam doesn't hesitate to go and try and rescue the kid and his nanny, which of course leads to even more shenanigans. And the kid is a little brat, generically like you would see on a sitcom, because he did want to get kidnapped for some reason, and the motive for it was blackmail, of course, but it's kind of a goofy little story. Overall, that story was okay. It really felt like a bad TV script from a sitcom that got thrown in the trash, but for younger readers, it's probably much more interesting. Overall, the best story was the Batman story with Penguin. It also probably had the best art. They did some interesting things with the panels in this one that you would see more of in comic books later down the road, but the majority of the stories still have sort of the same art style that you would see in newspapers from the time on the funny pages, but there is a lot more talking in some of the stories than you would have found in a newspaper just due to space. So an interesting sort of transition is happening in these issues than what you would see in the earlier ones, where the Detective 27 looked more like it was a daily strip or a Sunday strip that you would have seen in the newspaper. This one is starting to look more and more like sequential art that you would see in modern comics. So the evolution is noticeable between then and this issue. By far, the Batman story is the best, but the others are largely okay, but they are absolutely aimed at a younger audience, and it mostly shows in the way that the stories are told. I would absolutely recommend this. It was interesting to see how the Penguins changed over the years from just this short, weird-looking guy with a really long face to the crime boss that we see today. And the one-liners were a bit annoying. And of course, I'm really glad to see the side stories as well that are normally not reprinted. You don't get to see a lot of Slam Bradley or Cliff Crosby collections. And Larry Steele had some really cool art, especially on the backgrounds and the vehicles. They look really, really detailed. Unfortunately, it does show the limitations of the art of the time too, because the colors were very, very limited. And there's a couple panels that are just outright kind of silly looking because body proportions don't really line up, but it's still a fun ride. So if you get a chance to pick this up, I would say it's absolutely worth the $7 just for the historical aspect of seeing the stories that you would have seen if you bought this for the original 10-cent cover price. I thought this was a lot of fun, and because it is oversized, you really get your money's worth just on the diversity of stories and the number of stories in here. Yes, they are all the size of a backup story, but the Batman story was a lot of fun, and the others are, like I said, great artifacts of their time that are absolutely worth seeing for diehard comic readers. So if you get a chance to check this out, pick it up. It's a great addition to any collection and an interesting artifact of its time. That's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links are in the description to various support methods, and as always, we hope to see you on the next one.